Hello.
Thank you.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Dean of Student Affairs Leadership Conversation that we are hosting this afternoon. Welcome to everyone that's joining us from near and far. Far because, of course, this world of Zoom and the internet allows one to cross space and time. This conversation today is a very important one. It's one that really touches to an extent to the core of our humanity. It's a conversation that's about who we are, what we're about, our place in the world. And for Witzies, building on a proud tradition and perhaps again pushing the boundaries of what might be possible. I'm saying that because just over 30 years ago, it is at this university where the first Gay Pride March was held on the African continent. Now, whilst that is worth celebrating and whilst that is worth looking back on with pride, it is also a time perhaps for us to sit back and deeply reflect about where we are today, the journey we've walked, our 2021 reality, COVID and all. But what does that mean for queer bodies? What does that mean for the kind of world that we're trying to construct? What does that mean for the kind of university that we're busy working on? Next year, this great institution will be 100 years old. Perhaps this is the time for us to say, as we think about the next 100 years, we will challenge the boundaries of what it means to be inclusive, by what it means to be safe. And when we talk about social justice, perhaps it's social justice in Nancy Fraser's framing, which talk about recognition, deep recognition, not recognition at a superficial level, but recognition at the core of what we are, our culture, our values, our programs, our politics, our social life, our everything. What does that mean for us? So that students, student leaders, when you talk about these things, how do you take lessons from a brilliant lineup of speakers this afternoon? How do you listen to them, confront your own sets of issues, and I'll call it stuff that sits internal to you? The stuff perhaps that's in conflict with what you say. How do you confront that? How do you question that? We're going to listen to contextual experiences, contextual realities, and the leadership lessons that come from that. This is a platform Witzies, for you to learn, a platform for you to push your own boundaries, a platform for you to question, a platform for you to recreate. That's what I think part of my job is as Dean of Student Affairs. Because you're going to go out into this world, or perhaps stay at WITS as an academic, as an administrator, as a leader, or you're going to go into the world beyond, where you will, as a Witsie, occupy a leadership space. So how will your leadership make a difference? How will your leadership take us on a different journey? My pronouns are him and his. What are your pronouns this afternoon? And just at that basic level, how do you think about yourself? He, him, his, that is me. I'm now handing over to our wonderful program director, Sicle Mazeba. Sicle is a 21-year-old queer organizer, activist, avid reader, and mental health pursuer. She's critically studying towards a law degree at WITS. She has devotedly served in various student organizations that aim to create safe spaces for marginalized people, namely the WITS Students Bioethics Society, as well as Activate WITS. Sicle, thank you for availing yourself. I'll come back a bit later on. We are now firmly in your hands.
Thank you so much, Jerome. Okay. Wow, I am very, very honored to be here, to be surrounded by these amazing, amazing panelists. Before I do introduce them, I just want to give us a little bit of rules of engagement. The first thing is that we will be having a Q&A session. We do encourage students to participate and engage in this conversation. It is intended to be very interactive. So if you want to pose a question to the panelists, please do put it in the Q&A section that you will find at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a burning question, just put it in the chat and we will make sure that we try our best to get to all the questions. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists and just give them their brief bios. Our first speaker is Upumi Tetwa. Upumi Tetwa is an activist working on issues of economic, gender and LGBTI equality and justice. She was part of a group of activists that worked to enshrine the rights to equality, dignity and freedom for all in the South African Constitution. Our second speaker is Dr. Tisanda Msekele. Tisanda is a blind queer anthropologist, researcher, consultant for disability access and inclusion, and a motivational speaker. She holds a PhD in anthropology. Her research explored the intersection of disability, queerness, race, and socioeconomic status in the South African context. Our third speaker is Andrea Jacobs, who has been a community activist in the LGBTQIA+ sector in South Africa since 2009. They have been instrumental in the founding of several LGBTQI projects, including a university-endorsed student pride parade, the Safe Zones Project at WITS, the Kaleidoscope Youth Network in South Africa, and the Gala Youth Forum at the Gay and Lesbian Women in Action. Wow, these are amazing bios. Thank you so much to the panelists again for being here. We really appreciate your bios. Okay, so now I will open the conversation and we will start with Upumi Tetwa to give us a brief 10-minute opening remarks about her own journey with leadership and queerness. Thank you so much, Upumi.
Thank you so much, Sicle. Thank you so much to the Office of the Dean for having us. I am amongst my leaders. I would have loved to follow them in the speaking, but thank you so much. I can't emphasize how much it's important to pause and always think about leadership. I think sometimes we think titles are equivalent to leadership. And it's some of, for me, it's some of the important reflections I have. I think I have more questions about leadership today than 36 years ago when I started journeying. Maybe to give you a brief background of where I come from and then locate, leadership in the current context. I am of the generation of 86. There's the generation of 76, but I am of the generation of 86. I was, began my organizing around rent boycotts in Guatemala, in Eguruleni, around 86, and became a student activist at the time. And when I say 86, many who study history and who have an interest in history will also know how the East End was on fire during that time. I cannot say that I was also responsible for the fires because I did not show up at the TRC, but I'm part of that generation. And for me, my involvement starts everybody knows the situation of townships, right? During apartheid, from a working class family and organizing around basic things, like the right not to pay rent as both a pressure to put on the apartheid government, but because also our families were just not able to make ends meet. So it's a combination of struggles, right? So I am rooted in social movements. I am rooted in the anti-apartheid struggle, became part of many movements, COSAS particularly, including being part of the leadership in my SRC at my high school. This for me, I think, is important because that was probably my first coming out moment. And it's a moment in which I think what we can call the Olympics of oppressions become particularly marking, right? Am I going to be included because I am another fellow activist, but the minute you come out, it is not a priority. The issues of being lesbian and gay are not a priority. And something that truly continues to mark and frame how I think about movement work today. I think the second element, and I'm glad you lifted the Pride March that started, on the East Campus at Wits and went right through Hillbrow. A year after that, I was part of the leadership of the Gay and Lesbian Organization of the Witwatersrand, which coincided with me going to Wits Technical. That move from a closed, when I say closed, I mean the non-receptiveness of our communities, unfortunately, in embracing our sexuality, to then moving to live in Hillbrow, of course, also meant a possible ability of accessing a level of freedom to exercise my sexuality. I'm one of that generation that enjoyed and celebrated East Skyline when lesbians were not allowed, because I dressed in a particular way that made me get away with it, so to speak. But I think over time, and I mean, I've worked across the world, occupying, let's say, leadership positions in mixed social movements, as well as the International Gay and Lesbian Association Secretary. I was the first Secretary General of ILGA from the African continent. And one of the things I have always held in part of my activism and my approach is twofold, I think. Thinking about the importance of strengthening the movement of LGBTIQ people to be able to articulate needs, responsibilities, demands within that movement. And the second one, of course, ensuring that that LGBTIQ agenda is present in the broader other social movements, social justice, and so forth. But here's the thing about some of the questions I have about leadership that I think are particularly important for me to share, is that in our context where exclusion, discrimination, oppression, and a deepening inequality, it of course does make us wonder what type of leadership is necessary to address those multiple forms of oppression, right? And I think when I think about the leadership, and some of my reflections is even the twofoldness of my approaches to organizing, is where do we put the energies? And in South Africa, it becomes particularly stuck because we have a constitution enabling, or a promise of equality, a promise of embracing the differences that we have in our society. And yet we know that the inequalities that are not just about the fact that the bodies of LGBTIQ people are being picked up on the streets because they have been murdered, but also that the basic conditions that can enable us to access and enjoy those rights are just not available. And when one thinks about the leadership, to give leadership to those type of concerns, to give leadership to the part of to the elements that are deepening inequality. One of the unfortunate declines, I would say, is a diminishing voice of public thinking in relation to the context that South Africa is living under. Safe of hate crimes, cries, demands, the hate crimes bills, and so on. Dare I say that our voice has been minimal in relation to engaging with the political and social issues that are currently happening in the country. What does that imply for me in terms of questioning the type of leadership that is necessary? It requires for me to think about an approach that was particularly came up when people were assessing, and it continues to come out when some say, like, there are some people who sold out, and the Constitution is a symbol of selling out. And I beg to disagree with that, because I think part of our challenges today in our context is the ability to interlink the limitations of enjoying the promises that are there, challenging the deepening inequality that is not just a corruption, but corruption deepens it, but using that LGBTIQ lens. What do I mean? I mean that holding a balance or a nuance between the ability to celebrate and hold pride in all our diversities, whilst at the same time being able to recognize that so many people are unable to do that because of their social status, economic status, and so on. So some of the questions for me that continue to come up as I wrap up, that continue to come up in thinking about leadership and being rooted in social movements is really the caliber of leadership that is necessary. I believe in collective leadership, by the way. I do not believe in individual leadership. I believe in high impact and low ego as a fundamental thing about leadership. I believe in intergenerational leadership. I believe and hold that conflicts will arise in those notions of building a type of leadership that is informed by a strategy and a shared strategy and a shared tactic to respond to some of the nightmares that we are witnessing. I believe in a leadership that truly holds ethics, When I say that, it's not just a romanticized thing of I am against corruption, I am against fraud, I'm against all of these things, but it's an ethic that one can hold as a standard, that the one who is part of this collective leadership is holding themselves to those, not those. I saw 2 days ago the signing of the pledges that for the elections, but I will not comment about that. But I don't believe. I think it's those type of standards that are able to hold ourselves to our own contradictions, and in ethics, of course, integrity, honesty and everything. But there's something about conflict that as leaders or in that collective taking that we do not handle very well. And conflict, I want to submit that it is healthy. Conflict is healthy. What is unhealthy is not being able to discuss and engage in processes on how do we deal with conflict. How do we deal with conflict? If any fragmentation in my life I have seen and experienced is an inability to hold tension, then asisakhulumisani, we don't speak to each other, or we speak ill of each other. There are the fundamental principles about how we hold the differences amongst ourselves as we build that collective power to lead towards a transformative agenda remains crucial. We are not the same. We are not the same. We may be Black, we may be lesbian, we may be trans, we may be bi, we may be, from different classes with different conditions that we live with. We are not the same. And inclusivity is not just like a representative of each one of our differences to then say, now we have achieved inclusivity, but it's a full sense of understanding what makes us different and what is the importance of holding those differences as we try to transform our societies. So Sihle, I know I'm a bit over, but thank you so much. Those are my opening remarks. Happy to come in again. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you so much, Pumi. That was a very powerful statement. Our next speaker, who we would like to take us into unpacking this issue of leadership and queerness more, is Dr. Sisanda Msekele. So I'm handing it over to you, Dr.
Sisanda. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. And I feel very honored to have been invited to be part of this discussion. And talking about inclusivity, what I would like to do first for people in the audience who are visually impaired or blind, I would just like to give a description of my surroundings, just to make sure that everyone is brought into the picture. So what everyone is seeing, I am sitting on a royal blue couch, and behind me there are white walls and a big abstract painting with white dots and red and yellow circles. I am wearing, it's important that you know, I am wearing a yellow blazer and dark green button-up shirt, and I'm wearing a burgundy color lipstick, and I'm wearing round shaped Ray-Ban sunglasses, and I'm wearing my natural hair out and with the sides shaved. I am dark skinned, Black. It's important that I disclose that I'm Black, and my pronouns are she, her. So for me, I think inclusion runs so deep, and I think when it comes to queer leadership, it just began for me from the beginning when I turned blind when I was in matric, when I was 19, and the following year I had to come to university, and those were like big changes and things that have informed my identity a lot. And when I came to university, I was still in the closet, and I was dealing with losing my eyesight at the time, and you know how sometimes you prioritize things that you deal with. And in my journey, as I was like learning how to navigate the world as a blind person, I was also slowly learning how to live openly as a queer person. And I gradually like talked to people that I trusted about this, and I'm like, no, but this is gonna be so weird. Like, you know, I'm disabled and I don't know any other disabled people who are also queer. And then I met with Tish, and we had these discussions. And then like in my journey, as I'm like navigating the world as a blind and a queer person, I just realized that the spaces that I occupied, disability wasn't particularly anything that was addressed in queer spaces. It was not spoken about pretty much all the time. And I just kept wondering, but why is this not a thing that is spoken about? And I'm like, because these are lives that need to be acknowledged within the queer community. And then there began my journey as like, my interest in my research and my work became about queerness and disability. And this was like when I went to Gala this one time, when I was still like trying to come out of the closet and, you know, forming connections with other queer people. After one of the forums, this person who was attending the forum also came to me like, damn, so just tell me, you're blind and you're Black and you're disabled and you're a lesbian. Why would you do that to yourself? And, you know, those are like loaded questions. Like, these are the choices that you make. Are these the identities that you actually choose as a person? Because you're already like so oppressed. You are Black and you are disabled. Why would you also be queer? And that was, for me, at the beginning, I'm like, okay, this clearly there are stories that need to be told. There needs to be more visibility of disabled people within the queer spaces and the queer movement. And therefore, I began that journey. And I think when we look at these things, when we look at like leadership, I think like in the marginalized groups, it's easy to overlook certain groups that are like further marginalized. And I think like if you can look at the workplace and then the inclusion, and then they're like, okay, we are all inclusive. But like in that process of being inclusive, let's say you're like, let's hire more Black women. First of all, let's hire women. Okay, what kind of women are we hiring? Okay, we're realizing that it's only white women. Then let's include Black women. But then how far do you take it? Within the Black women in leadership, do you then see Black disabled women? Maybe. But then within that, do you also see Black, disabled, and queer women? Like, how far are you willing to take it with your inclusion? And then, like, I just realized there could be within the spaces, there could be, okay, we are dealing with race, but within the race, there's ableism that nobody's talking about, and there's homophobia that nobody's talking about, and even in like disability spaces where there's like, there can be like an overlooking of race. I think these things overlap in ways that I think people aren't really willing to dig in that deep as to like, okay, I mean, I believe in addressing the elephant in the room, and it becomes often uncomfortable because it's like, okay, we are organizing this, but have we considered access for people with different needs while we're organizing this queer event, for instance? And as I was like, throughout my PhD, and when I was like looking into the history, and Sis put me like, thank you for your activism and all the work that you've done. And I think when I was looking into the history, like during the apartheid, when the likes of Simon Gurley and Bev DT, like, you know, they were like very out there activists, and like that's where I think the intersectionality was sort of like founded in the South African context, where Simon was like, yeah, you know, I'm Black and I'm being discriminated for that, but I'm also a gay man. So these issues are equally important. And then it became more about like, you know, sexuality and racism that was being fought. And on the other side, which was not in conjunction with this struggle, there was like a group of disabled people who were fighting to also be acknowledged as humans who deserve rights within the South African context. And these were like happening in parallel. There was no point in the past where they were like, okay, but also the disabled people have sexualities. And I think because activism moves as we move with times, we're like, okay, we've addressed this. How about we address this now? And I think disabled people have fought so much to be acknowledged as human beings, and therefore are deserving of human rights. But sexuality of disabled people has long been something that nobody is really willing to talk about. And there's been like a lot of myths around it. And I think like a lot of scholars then have come and have addressed this issue, like, but disabled people have sexualities too. But then how far are you willing to take it within the South African context? And then when I looked, I'm like, nobody is really digging in so deep as to like, what about the queer sexualities of disabled people? How are those people represented? And how does that representation look? And that's where I was like, okay, now this is the time we add the layer to the intersectionality within the queerness. How about disabled queer people? And I think that is like one of the things I find extremely lacking in the activism today. And as a leader, and I think it's like very important to also be able to, you know, hold people accountable for these things within the spaces, and also while being self-reflective and acknowledging all the privileges that I also have within, like, because also I think the socioeconomic status is a big issue, and that has been revealed in my study as to like, okay, but like I am sitting here, you know, listening to people's stories, disabled queer people who are very happy to have people listen to them and recording their stories, not just as people who exist, but the kind of people that they are and how they live. And then, okay, but like in what position I am this educated university student, and I am interacting with a lot of different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races. And it's just become like, I always feel like it's like we are a rainbow nation and we are queer, and then there's like people with disabilities, multiple forms of disabilities. And how does that all fit within the spectrum? And I just think that's something that needs to be further unpacked without running the risk of oppressing certain elements of people's identities in the process. So I don't know how I'm doing with time.
You have reached your 10 minutes.
Am I still within the 10 minutes? But I think for me, it's just, as leaders, we need to also hold each other accountable while also being self-reflective within the leadership. Because now it's no longer just about inclusion, but it's also about the inclusion that is not harmful to everyone who's being included. Thank you.
Oh, that's so inspirational. I love that you brought in intersectionality, because I think it's such a very important aspect for our activism. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, our third, last but not least, certainly not least, speaker is Anzio. Anzio, I'm handing it over to you. Please try to keep it within the time constraint. Thank you so much.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Jacobs. I use they, them pronouns. I am seated in front of a gray wall with a painting, a white painting, gold frame behind me, wearing a black t-shirt, one earring. I have my hair out in an afro, and I am often identified as a colored South African. I think that being following on from Kumi and Sisanda is really an interesting one, because it's really an honor to kind of be held on the shoulders of giants. These are two remarkable activists who have made such meaningful contributions to not only the sector, but the country and even beyond the borders of this country. So I'm going to try and keep my journey short. I want to share some of my life history with you. I started my activism around 2006, not knowing that it was called that on a school bus. There were a lot of people around me who wanted to know about sex. And we weren't talking about straight sex, and we had to find our own answers. And that's really what kicked off my interest in this particular kind of field. I identify as a queer individual. And so the sex that I have wasn't taught to me at school. There was also no room for my identity to be built in those formative years. Subsequently, I was lucky enough to make it into Wits University. And in my first year, there were a group of friends and I who kind of met each other and hung out together. And we were having similar conversations to what we were having, you know, in 2006 on the bus, where people really wanted to know information that wasn't readily available because queer representation at that point wasn't really big. And I think at that point in our conversations, the Gala Youth Forum was born, or that the concept at least thereof. There were several people involved, including Tish White at the time, who was one of the activists on campus, who I don't think gets recognized enough for the contribution that they've made. Thereafter, Wits Pride was the next feat. I see that Anne Lansky is part of the audience here today, and Anne was one of the many people in the network of people that put together the first university-endorsed Pride. So as was mentioned earlier on, about 30 years back, Wits University had the first Pride starting in the university. But in 2010, the university actually put money towards the Pride, which was its, I think, quite a significant contribution. Thereafter, I chaired the Kaleidoscope Youth Network and joined the joint working group, which were national collectives where national conversations were starting to happen. I think at the time I was too young and perhaps naive to understand the magnitude of the space that we were sitting in. And I think that from a leadership position now, those were probably the most essential years to my activism and the formation thereof. I went on to work at San Diego State University briefly after introducing the Safe Zones idea at WITS to the Transformation Office through engaging with San Diego State University. And of course, there were many people involved there, again, including Tish White. And when I returned to the country several years later, I think it was around the time of Fees Must Fall. I'd been financially excluded from the institution despite arriving on scholarship. And I realized how many other people were impacted. And I think that Sasanda brings a really interesting point around intersectionality that was key for me at that point in time, because we really started to see the haves versus the have-nots. And then in that, start to see the differences between the people that were being affected in Fees Must Fall. I was, as I said, financially excluded from WITS. I was fortunate enough, however, to join the administration of the university at some point. And seeing the university from both sides of the coin was really interesting. I started to really notice a need for queer-specific space, but I also noticed that the queer space that was being created at Wits University was being created along racial lines, which was unfortunate for me. There were differential experiences. And so I started to notice things like the times that the events were being held, being too late for those that were using public transport, or the nature of the events that were being held kind of when it was over a weekend at inconvenient times for people to access them. And that really spurred my interest in what, when I later ended up working at Gala, what the archive was doing, and noticing that the archive that had been generated and created over a long period of time told stories about people of color that were generally sad, that were generally about HIV and AIDS, that were generally these negative and hard stories. And I think part of my leadership of the Youth Forum over, unfortunately now probably 10, 11 years, has really been about inserting a positive Black queer narrative in that space, allowing Black queer students to tell their own stories and feel like they own the archive as much as they should, because the archive couldn't exist without us. I think another thing that I've learned while engaging with students and leaders alike over the years is that an intersectional approach to our activism is really essential. And intersectionality has been explained before, but I think that when we think about that intersectionality, it really does link to something that Pumi had said. You know, we are seeking leadership in queer communities that is ethical, that is built on integrity, and that makes room for conflict. And I think that that's been a really hard journey, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, where activists, I think, a younger generation of activists are increasingly woke and kind of build politics around that wokeness. And what that wokeness does is it asks us to be critical and interrogate the spaces that we're in. And so I think, you know, after founding Scope in 2017 with my colleague Jen, the work shifted then to being really mindful about the type of queer leadership spaces that are necessary to drive the LGBTQ agenda here in the South African context. I use the word agenda very loosely, please don't quote me on it. But the type of national engagement that we have needs transparency, needs accountability, and needs bona fide practice. I think that that's useful in all realms of leadership. I think that it's essential for the type of work that we do in relation not only to LGBTQ rights, but human rights more broadly. And as I wrap up, I'd like to really just give a second to think about the intergenerational conversation that I think is now prudent more than ever. That collective idea of leadership, I think I experienced for the first time during the period of Feast Must Fall. There was a deep desire for flat structure, for leadership to be from the people and for the people. And I think that that's perhaps the best way that we can move ahead as a sector and move ahead in various facets of our society, when we understand that people have different experiences. People's experiences are informed by their socioeconomics, their geolocations at particular points in time, and the experiences that they have. And when we're not cognizant of that, we lose sight of the fact that we sometimes speak as if everybody is a monolith, that our experiences are uniform, and that we don't need to worry about the next person because their experience will be the same as ours. And as Sasanda pointed out earlier on, that's definitely not the case. So taking the baton from Glow, I was fortunate enough to be part of the Activate leadership. I won't mention the year, and now, you know, have spent some time with the Youth Forum. And I think in founding an LGBTQ organization that works here in the country, where my leadership journey now is at is in ensuring that people, particularly in rural and peri-urban contexts, access the resources that we hold in the cities. And we do hold them. We really, people are often unable to access the same information that we would have at the press of a button just because of where they are. We do that through the type of engagement that I've learned is necessary in corporate space, in government space. I've been fortunate to work in the space of advertising recently as well. And I've realized that unless we hit all of these areas at the same time, unless we are indeed considerate of intersectional politics, that our work will never end, because we're always focusing on just one struggle at a time, not realizing that we are multifaceted beings that need the entirety of our beings taken care of. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I will open the Q&A session now. I see we don't have any questions posed at the moment in the Q&A box. I'm encouraging students to type in their questions. But while we do, I will begin the Q&A session. This question, I think, is particularly for Andrea. So something that I have realized is that there continues to be this vacuum between, or rather, there continues to be this vacuum in queer access, queer literary access, right? So what I heard a lot of queer people who come from Yomdantanes, Wamashi, Guatemala, saying that, hey, when I first came to Johannesburg, when I first came to Wits, I was bombarded by all these queer terminology and all these literary queers. And I felt very excluded from these spaces because I didn't have access to your Audre Lorde, your like very prominent queer writers, theorists. So my question is essentially, how do we bridge that gap? How do we begin bridging that gap and facilitating queer knowledge to all South Africans, all queer South Africans?
That's such an interesting question. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat and I noticed that Tish is here. So again, big ups to Tish, because Tish has been kind of a rock in the Wits community for many, many years around LGBTQ issues and issues more broadly around disability as well. I think that there is indeed a vacuum, and it's a huge part of the work that I do to try and undo that vacuum. One, LGBTQIA+ identities are often named in that way, and they are spoken about in that way. And the reality is that in rural and peri-urban communities, abogogo bethu, abobhuti bethu, they don't know that language. They don't know a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, poly, pansexual. They don't have that language, right? And so if we were to create that repertoire of knowledge, I think that what's really essential is for us to return to what knowledge we had before this terminology became available to us. Yes, perhaps the terms that we have in our indigenous languages aren't the nicest terms, but they are a starting point for our conversations. And so that has been kind of really deeply embedded in the work. The second thing is that particularly when I do youth-related work, I really try and focus on documenting and asking youth to document themselves, particularly Black queer youth, because a story is a lot more accessible when we recognize it. I remember at one of these talks, Zozi was on, and she was talking about where she came from and how it was that people were engaging with her having won Miss World. And that was I hope I'm using the correct title. I hope it's Miss World. But that was an interesting time for me because I realized that our own communities struggle to engage with us because we don't use language that is understandable or accessible to the communities that we come from oftentimes. And so if we start to do that work, if we make sure that there's visibility of our communities, I think that's a great start. Recently, I was lucky to work with Cremora on the remake of It's Not Inside, It's on Top. And we had Nomsa Shezi, who is a Black lesbian woman in the ad calling on her partner wearing a rainbow flag. Now, to the ordinary person, to the next person, it doesn't seem like such a big deal. But to have a Black lesbian woman on your screen calling their woman partner in a pride flag is a big deal. Because in our context, we've been so used to seeing celebrities who are whose queerness is almost made caricature. So, you've got someone like Somizi, who's a wonderful person, a wonderful activist, but at the same time, you then end up with a situation where everybody understands that that is what queer means, or that's what gay means. And so we need to diversify that narrative so that when we do go back home, we can point at the TV and not only have a Stenzo and Jason reference or a Somizi reference, because there's so much diversity in our communities. I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much time, so I'll leave it at that. Sihle, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, great. We have a question from Danielle Goss, and Danielle asked, what advice would you all like to give to someone who is an aspiring leader in these spaces, especially for someone who is young and unsure of themselves? So I don't know if any of the panelists want to jump in and answer this question. I'm gonna throw it to Kumi and then Sisanda.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much, Sisanda and Anzio, for your contributions thus far. To try and respond to Danielle, there's something about participation, I think, that is important. In my experience, I don't think there is any movement I joined to be a leader, but I joined because maybe of the political agenda, of the purpose of a particular space or movement or organization that was responding to what I wanted to contribute. And I think through that, of course, one learns and climb the steps of responsibility. And that's what I think is something for me that is like a calling, so to speak, a calling to a political cause. And I think it is important to underline that and I think Sisanda raised it so well, that there are experiences of being unwelcomed sometimes, even when we identify to the political cause, that the space may not be welcoming. And I think it is often that that is unwelcoming, that has to keep us on our toes, to question, to be critical, to even question the political purpose of such a space or such an organization existing, yet at the same time is not welcoming. So to Danielle, I think for me, self-determination, self-identifying, you give yourself the labels or the identities that you hold, and you identify that political purpose and that reasoning of why you want to participate in a particular space, and knowing that they may not be welcoming. But if you are clear and determined to your calling, then I am sure you will stay on your toes to keep fighting for the type of liberation we want.
Thank you so much. I wanted to do this question to Dr. Nsekele, but I think I will ask it in conjunction with the question from Wiswa, who asked, what course did you do, Sisola?
Dr. Msekele, you are muted. Still muted.
Still on mute.
Okay. Sorry about that. I studied anthropology, and I have a background in psychology, sociology, and politics. But my master's and PhD, I did that in anthropology.
Okay. The other question seems to have slipped my mind, but basically, let me just go back to the question from Danielle, because I'd like for you to answer it. Hold on. Oh. What advice would you like to give to someone who's an aspiring leader in this space, especially for someone who is young and unsure of themselves?
Is that for me?
Yes, it is for you.
Oh, okay. I think it all begins with being unsure of yourself. I think that is like acknowledging that you are unsure. That is actually one of the biggest qualities of a leader. And I think in your journey to discover who you actually are, that's where you get to you look for the spaces and you look for the causes, as Sis Pumi was saying earlier. You look for the things that interest you, and you invest time, and you participate with intentions, with seeking to belong, and in the process discovering the kind of person that you are. And I think we really underestimate how much we learn in participation. You don't even have to be an active participant. You can just go into a space and be passive and learn, see how people do things, how people identify, how people move through the world. And through that, you actually learn, because you look at the next person like, oh, this is how they do, and this is how they identify, and this is what they're passionate about. And then within that, you then learn the things that make you who you are.
Thank you so much. Okay, the next comment is from Harold Cloutier, and I would like Andrea to speak to it, because I think it brings in this intersectionality that we've been speaking about. And Harold says, I have been reflecting on what inclusion means for queer people that are classified as colored.
That's such an interesting question. Before I go there, I just wanted to respond to Amali, to Danielle, and just make a note that, you know, sometimes we think of leadership as one thing. And I think that on this journey, I've realized that there are many different kinds of leaders. There are some that are soft and silent. You know, I think of someone like Elspeth, who is the director of the Triangle Project in the Western Cape. For many years, I had no clue what she looked like, because she just doesn't take up space in front of a camera or a microphone. She works silently in the background. And then there are the out loud, proud, vocal activists like Bev Ditsi, who, you know, you'll know just by the mention of her name. And what's beautiful about that is that we see that there's a wide variety of leadership. And so as you're figuring yourself out, just know that you don't need to be a particular kind of leader. Leadership comes in all shapes and forms. As for Gerald's question, I think that reflecting on inclusion and what it means to be queer and colored is a really interesting one, because I think that colored identity in the South African context often operates from the space of a void. Colored identity starts at the place of not, or starts off the place of nothingness. We are first the mixed people, then we are the mixed people that are mixed in particular ways. You may be biracial or identify as biracial instead of colored because of a political agenda. When you want to associate with blackness, maybe your blackness is not black enough for that particular politic. And I think that understanding that multiplicity of colored identity is one of the first instances where we can start to experience inclusion, where we can understand that colored identities are not monolithic, where we can understand that colored people are not one thing, that colored society does not perform the same way in even different parts of the country, let alone in Johannesburg. But for me, I think, just to expand on that a little bit more, there were certain privileges that are associated, I remember, during Feast Must Fall, with skin color, and it was undeniable. Those that were lighter in complexion received differential treatment to those that were darker in complexion. And I know this because in moments where people were speaking out, one of the things that in hindsight I'm very mindful of is that Feast Must Fall was a moment where Black working class students were making a stand. And yet it was only light-skinned folk that always took to the mic, myself included, to tell that story, to tell it better, because we always know better. And that's something that we need to talk about, right? We need to take ownership of the fact that having an intersectional identity is not just one person's experience. Many people, no, all people have intersectional identities. And when we're not mindful of what we foreground and background in our identities, sometimes we can do more harm than good, even when we think that we're doing the right thing. I hope that answers your question, Gerald.
Thank you so much. Okay, the next question is from Amelie Raven, and I really like this question. And Amelie says, speaking of marginalized joy, what do you all do to create pockets of Black, queer, and disabled joy in your everyday lives during these unprecedented and difficult times? Any practical tips? I'm going to start with Pumi.
I'm so old-fashioned. I've been chatted so much by friends and comrades around the world to really think about things that give me joy during these unprecedented times, you know. It's been tough. It's been tough in a way in which care has taken a completely new dimension, you know. And I think it's important as LGBTIQ people to think about expectations that come to us, and many of us maybe who don't have children, who are very much on the outside of our family, intimate biological family structures. And one of the things in the deep lockdown that I accompanied was support for LGBTI people who had to return home, and talking about what it meant to be back at home and find the joys that they find when they are outside of home. And because you return to a home that is not homely, you return to a place because of lockdown that never gives joy, because it unravels the very reasons of why you don't call it home. And because your joy, your possibilities of joy, and even thinking about thriving have been taken away. But one of the things that I have found is very much, even in the distances of Zoom, being on Zoom and so on, are some of the connections, some of the connections that speak to safety, that speak to creating community, even when it's hard. And I think that is something that I think our extended communities play a fundamental role, like that list of 20 people that you have that you can call at any given time, and create the spaces that both can hold the pains and the traumas of these moments, but at the same time can revive, give reason and meaning to life, and especially when life has become so unfortunately cheap in our times. And I think for me, the creativity that I have also been able to, to have access to and enjoy, because I'm not so creative, but I've enjoyed the offers, the artistic offers that, that exist. And there's so much richness in the country and in our continent in terms of appreciation of that production. And I also find ways in terms of hiding in other literary work, although I have to read a lot about pay work. But I think it's a balance. There isn't any one thing that I think gives one person joy, but there are multiple things that give people joy. And I think community, when we can't see each other, but being able to forge community, has been absolutely fundamental in these times. Because isolation, as we know, has contributed immensely to mental health, to the high rates of suicides that we see, and to many, many other things. So that thing of like not breaking the community bonds, fundamental.
Oh, thank you so much, Kumi. I'm going to give this question to Sisanda now. How do you, just to reiterate the question, speaking of marginalized joy, what do you do to create pockets of Black, queer, and disabled joy in your everyday life during these unprecedented and difficult times?
Okay. I like that question very much. Thank you. And I think these have been like I think for both queer and disabled people, of course, that does not exclude other people, but I'm just gonna pay attention to that for now. As Pumi has highlighted, people having to, like a lot of queer people having to go back to homes where they don't feel at home. And I think it's applied also to a lot of disabled people, where some people who lived there every day through care, disabled people and chronically sick people. And then like when the pandemic struck, some people lost that. They didn't have people coming to care for them. Therefore, they had to like find ways to get through a day. And then some of the people who like have been living alone have had now to go back home to be cared for by their family members, whatever that looks like. And it's just been, I think it's been a very stuck moment for people in that way, because the little independence that you sometimes thought you had is just now been taken away from you. And the little things like, walking outside, if you depend in my case, for instance, on touch to experience the world, the pandemic has sort of like taken that away from you. You are restricted. You can't go outside and be touching everything, and because it's just very important that you don't do that. And like now you have to cultivate these little ways of you know, getting through the everyday. And for me, it's been, I think, because I had to complete my PhD in the like storm of the pandemic last year when it was like at its peak. And I think my mental health took the greatest toll. So I had to like step back, and I found little joys and pleasures in doing the very little everyday things that I thought were just a nuisance to get, just you have to do it to get through the day. You have to take a shower and you have to eat and you have to do this, but it's something that you have to do. But now I've just sort of like taken a step back and actually get into a shower and enjoy how it makes me feel, like finding little pleasures in those little things and actually eating the food and enjoying it, and not being always so, because I think the pandemic has brought us to our knees, most of us. And now you're like, you know what, I am trying to survive here. And sometimes all you have access to is the tiniest little pleasures. It could be food, it could be taking a long bath. I mean, I thought long baths were so boring. Like, who has time to do that? Like, you get bored. And the pandemic is sort of like taught me that these are the little things, these very small everydays that actually make life quite bearable. So that's what I've been doing, and trying to stay away from really intense academic reading as I recover, and just doing what I can, but also not neglecting the little things that make my day.
Okay. Thank you so much. See, Andrea, again, to reiterate the question, speaking of marginalized joy, what do you do to create pockets of Black, queer, and disabled joy in your everyday lives during these unprecedented and difficult times?
I was fortunate. I got to write notes as others were speaking. I think for me, one of the greatest discoveries in the COVID period has been that of rest. I think that our world moves so fast, and it's moving even faster because we are always attached to a screen now. You know, you move from one Zoom meeting to the next, or one Zoom engagement to the next. And then when you're not on Zoom, you're on your cell phone. And when you're not on your cell phone, you're attached to some other screen. And I think that rest has become such a key thing to experience joy. I've realized that when I'm resting, I'm a lot more attentive at home. I'm a lot more attentive to my partner, and my partner is a great source of joy for me. I think the other one is boundary setting. I'm taking great joy at the moment, particularly when it comes to corporate space and saying no to certain things. I think that we're often following money. We've been conditioned to follow money. And sometimes it's okay to say no to things. And it's not always possible, but in moments where it is being able to say, no, I will not do this, or no, I will not work beyond this time, or no, I will not engage in this way, has been extremely powerful. As a person of color, I think saying no has been the greatest tool I've learned in the pandemic. Affirmation, acknowledging, and also engaging with friends, family, and peers. I think that it's been incredible to be engaging with people internationally, to hear what the experiences, not only of COVID, but of that very joy are for people in the global South. I've been very fortunate to be engaging a lot with colleagues in India and in the South Americas, and their experiences are so different now because of COVID. As Sisanda said, there are moments where we don't see the needs of others because they are hidden from us in our everyday, and understanding that perhaps in Sisanda's case, it may be, needing support in the homestead, but in other people's cases, it's basic access to food, or being able to go to a social space that is not toxic like the home environment is for them. And that's been really important. Then I think also celebrating death and mourning, which was not something I was accustomed to doing before. Coming from a family that has rituals, mourning and death is a very big part of culture. And not being able to mourn in a particular way was very challenging, but being able to relearn how to mourn, being able to mourn in a place away from home has been really interesting. And then just finally, understanding that while our time may be finite, time itself is infinite. And so understanding that maybe my contribution will have to stop at some point, but someone else will make another meaningful contribution to the world. I don't need to do everything. And I think particularly in the space of activism, that's a very hard lesson to learn. We just want to be there for everybody, particularly in this time, you know, during the COVID pandemic, as Pumi's alluded to, there's been so much death. People that look like us, that have experiences like ours, are being killed, and relearning how to mourn and relearning how to engage in a digital space has been really weird. But there's been some comfort in knowing that there are people that are just on the other side of the screen that you can reach out to. So those have been my little pockets of joy and what I've been doing. Okay,
wow, thank you so much. Okay, our final question, for sake of time, is a very important question, and I think every one of us has experienced this at some point in our lives. From Melisha N, if you've got a friend who's been kicked out of their home when coming out, how do we assist them? I think let me give this to Sandra to start off. If you have any insight on how we can be there for or assist a friend or anyone you know who's been kicked out of their home after coming out.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think it's, I think help comes in so many forms, and I think we are all at different stages in our lives where we can offer certain things and unable to offer other things. And I think helping a friend who's been kicked out, it also depends on your capacity at the moment. What can you offer that person? You might be in a position where you don't even have an space in your own home to accommodate them. But I think these are the times where you actually use your own connections to, I mean, I think when you are in a position where you are not homeless, you are therefore at a point where you are able to reach out to many other people who can maybe facilitate the help if you are unable to do so. And I feel like we all have that. We can reach out to someone when you can't provide the help that the person needs. But of course, if you can provide the help, of course, you can say, well, you can come stay over at my place, or we can hustle together if there's no food. I mean, like help can come in so many ways. And sometimes you like connect people with people that they don't know. And I think that's just been the greatest thing about also, like Enzio mentioned, like behind the screen, there are like so many people who are ready to help behind the screens, and you can reach so many people through that. And I think we are the generation that is so interconnected. We know so many people that we have never met. And I think in these instances, that's when you actually tap into those resources. And I think for me, that's what I would find very useful in terms of like a helping tool to a friend who has been kicked out.
Thank you so much. I want to just squeeze in the last question.
Sorry, can I maybe interrupt you just for a practical thing? Just for Melisha, there are organizations that are able to give access to accommodation, especially when people are kicked out of home. For LGBTQ persons in particular, it's a bit harder to find those placements, but it's not like they're unavailable. You know, a recent piece of work that we've been doing in Gauteng in particular in relation to local government, but also with the help of NGOs, is that Gauteng has now allocated a space that will become a safe house. We hope, you know, these things with government are always, the timeline is uncertain, but we have been working towards creating a shelter outside of the Western Cape, and also training shelters more generally to take on people that are part of the LGBTQIA+ community. But also another interesting part of that, the story there is that police are now going to be trained a lot more heavily within the Gauteng province at least. And so if you do want to reach out, Gala, Iranti, Scope, Access Chapter 2, just amongst other organizations. I'm sure I'm missing a handful now, but those are the ones off the top of my head. Please do reach out. It's as simple as a Google search for LGBT NGOs. Sorry for taking time.
No problem. I see that Jerome has given some information. So thank you so much, Jerome, for giving us that information. Okay. I'm going to have to close the Q&A session for sake of time so that I can give our speakers some brief time to just give us closing remarks, closing statements, just to leave us with this here webinar. So I'm going to just start with you again, Susanna, just to give us any brief closing remarks from you.
I think for me, it's so important in this time in our lives. I would just my closing remarks would be I think everyone at the moment is going through so much, and I think we need to extend our hands as much as we can to the person in need. And I think that is, talking about leadership, that on its own is a form of leadership. And I think we need each other more than we ever did before. And as this community, we are faced with so many challenges, and therefore we have needs that are following us on a daily basis. And I think now is the time for us to really unite and offer the help that we can to the next person, and remembering to be kind. That is a form of leadership. Like Enzio said, there can be soft ways and loud ways and quiet ways of being a leader. And I think now we're just being tested within our capacity. We need to show up for each other. And I think that is the greatest form of leadership. That's what keeps our community together. And thank you so much for joining in the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. For me, any closing remarks, closing statements?
Yes, I just found joy. My 8-year-old just walked back from school. That question around services, on the last round, and in thinking about leadership, there are many organizations, and I'm glad, Andrea, you mentioned also following Sisanda on the services. The one thing I think that is important about participation and showing leadership is really in thinking about the needs of our people. The needs are so vast, and there are few organizations really working very hard to respond to the needs of our people. And I think part of our responsibility is always to ask, what is limiting the organizations in order to respond, and how can I help? How can we help? And so on. So I'm hoping that also in the framing of those questions, that we live today thinking about what is my role? What can I do, to contribute to eliminating the nightmares that we see around us that inhibit our possibilities of joy. And just again, to just say that these conversations are so important. There are so many forms of leadership. And it is my hope that in this moment, that we are all able to show up, because our country is really in a mess in so many ways. It's really, really in a mess. And it's going to need all of us to think about the solutions that are beyond what we are hearing in this electioneering period, but ones that are really transformative. And I'm hoping that we start by also thinking about our own biases, our own prejudices, and our own oppressions, so that we can think about, what collectively we can build. So thank you so much for having me this afternoon and for creating the space. And thanks, Anzio and Sisanda, for your wonderful contributions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, again, for the closing remarks is the Anzio. Thank you.
So just again, it's such a privilege to be standing amongst the giants that are on this panel. It's such a great honor to speak on the same panel as you. I see that there was a question that will help me close my remarks from Vuyiswa. I think Vuyiswa, be safe, be genuine, be realistic, and be present when dealing with others, especially when you're not sure of yourself in those moments. So be safe, genuine, realistic, and present. We can't always save the world. Sometimes in doing so, we could put ourselves in danger. It's always useful to know that when we are unable to do something, other people may be able to do something. And as part of the leadership journey, I think that one, it's remarkable to be called a leader by an institution where I've faced so many challenges over the years. But at the same time, I think that the invite and the reason that I'm able to sit on this panel is because of many of the people that are in this chat, many of the people that work tirelessly behind the scenes at Wits University and other institutions, such as the NGOs in Johannesburg and around the country. And so just in closing, I'd like to encourage those that are thinking of taking up leadership positions and engaging in leadership, to keep at the heart of your leadership journey the need for constant transparency, the need for absolute accountability, and the dire need for bona fide practice. Our country still has such a long way to go, and if we can keep those things at the heart of our journey, we'll go back to Pumi's ethics, integrity, and healthy conflict. Thank you.
Right, then that brings us to the end of our conversation. I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to MC this amongst these amazing panelists. So thank you very much. I will now be handing over to Tish, and Tish is just going to talk about support services available at Wits for the LGBTQIA+ community. So Tish.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm Tish Lemas, and I would like to acknowledge the organizers and the panelists for giving some amazing insights today. Thank you so much. What I want to share with you are some of the support services offered by Wits University to LGBTIQ+ people. I'm going to put them in the chat. They should be accessible in that regard. Whilst I'm waiting for them to make it into the chat, I'll just go through them quickly. So Anzio had spoken about safe zones at Wits. So we've developed an allyship program. To date, we've trained over 400 allies. We go through extensive training to offer comprehensive support and referral to people in their spaces who need what we refer to as a safe space. This also includes everybody who works for CCDU. They are all safe zones of Wits allies. And a big part of our work at Safe Zones of Wits is to make sure that our facilitation is made available to the university community. To do so, we know that students relate more than anything else to other students. So one of my tasks that I really take seriously is to train student leaders to be the trainers for Safe Zones of Wits, and they do so very well. We're currently on version 5 of our training manual. We're speaking directly to intersectionality as we go about so, looking at disability, language, race, living in the global south, and other particularly important topics. So the second item is a queer social justice cohort, which in part is hopefully going to become less needed in time. So it was a collaboration between Safe Zones of Wits and the Dean of Students. And the fallout of COVID-19 saw the home circumstances of our queer students become particularly concerning. So the cohorts sought an attempt to bring those in crisis in touch with people who could help them, like our crisis line, CCDU, GEO, etc. And we were able to bring back some of them to campus to residences, particularly those who were in very difficult home environments. And a support group exists for these particular students in times of need. So for example, over the festive season last year. We also have the Vids Queer Clothing Bank, which is clothing that's been donated for queer students who are experiencing homelessness. We've recently been donated binders for students who can't afford their own binders, currently distributing those. We offer guest lectures to different academic subjects. So this year we've done some of the students who are coming into medicine in GEM 2, and traditionally also done social work and psychology, teaching about queerness that is examinable and is taken very seriously. Those of you who are on campus will know, well, you might not have counted them, but we have 52 gender neutral toilets. The main rule that we try and go with is that nobody can police somebody else's access to a toilet space based on how they perceive somebody's gender or sexual orientation. But we do ask that priority use is afforded to people with disabilities for the toilets that are gender neutral, that are wheelchair accessible. We have a partnership with Be True to Me, which offers a weekly support group for trans masc or trans femme people in collaboration with Safe Zones of Vids. So when things become increasingly safer, we'll go back to having meetings in person at Vids. Safer sex barriers can be collected from Vids Disability Rights Unit, where I'm currently based. If you want to collect such, just let me know in advance and we'll make sure that they're available to you. In terms of policy protection, you might not know, but queerness specifically features in the Student Code of Conduct, in Gender Equity Office policies, and the anti-discrimination policy of our university. So I'm going to ask that if any of this sounds like something you or a friend needs, that you please get in touch with me and refer that particular person. I'm not having luck. Oh, yes, I am having luck. There are my contact details. Just put them in the chat. Thank you very much. I will be silent now.
Thank you so much, Sis. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Gerald September to give us the vote slide.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My job is really simple at the end, and that is to thank everyone who've joined us today, but particularly to pay attention to our speakers who have shared so generously of their own journeys, their own struggles, their own victories, their joy, the issues that they still grapple with, and how that has shaped, to an extent, their leadership. I think at some level I'm kind of mad with myself because I'm the one who every 2 weeks before an exam declare a moratorium so that no events can take place. And I'm thinking in my mind, a follow-up conversation to this one is so critical. But I guess it's something that we need to think about as we think about the new year and how we think about the things that we do. So much came out of this. And what stood out for me was also how this conversation didn't focus on often what people would talk to you about when they talk about leadership. Often people will say, well, you need to follow this formula. I joined this society, I did this and that, and then I got elected to that body. Or they'll talk about leadership styles and those sorts of things that you need to display. This conversation, at least my takeaways, forces us to connect very deeply with our truth and to connect very, very deeply with broader purpose. And this conversation said to us, you don't join an organization because you want to be its leader, but you join it because you believe in the cause. You believe in what it stands for, in the difference that it wants to make in the world, in how it wants to shape our world. And that's what you do. It said to us that you don't need to be the chairperson or the whoever, just the participation, just being there, that's where the leadership sits. And I think that pushes you, Vitsis, who's super competitive, who wants the edge because you want to go out there and perhaps occupy the position. It's pushing you to think about your purpose. It's pushing you to connect with your deep truth and the things, your world, and the kind of world that you want to shape. And for that, linking it to the intersectionalities that came through so powerful, for that, I am most grateful to the panel. And I want to thank you for having brought us to this point where we can, in our last conversation, where we can really just go back to the core, go back to the essence of who we are and how we use that to connect to a greater world. Thank you. So to each one of our panelists, we are most grateful to you for having done that. Sicle, you were wonderful in steering the conversation, in keeping us to time, in making sure that the key points are pulled together and weaving that so that we get kind of where what the essence of what our speakers were telling us is about. Tish, recognizing you for your amazing work. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being that beacon of hope in how you support, in how you push boundaries, in how you hold accountable for us shaping the kind of destiny and the kind of world that we are about. Colleagues, friends, we're going to end it here. Next week, we have a book club. The book club next week will be with Professor Marwala, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, where we're going to look at his book, Leadership Lessons from the Books I've Read. I hope you will join us for that. But for tonight and for this conversation, thank you. And I wish you all the best for the journey ahead. And please do tap into the services that's available. And from the Dean of Students Office, I make the commitment that we will walk this journey with you. I think one of the speakers said something about being safe, being genuine, being realistic, and being present. That is the journey that I undertake to walk with you as we co-create, recreate, panel beat, and get this university and this country to what we desire it to be. Good night.